It's an interesting voice from Preston.
Yeah. All right. Hi, everyone.
Even though there's
We're going to get started. Hello. Thank you for being here. I'm Kirsten Shirk. I'm the Director of Communications at the International Center for Research on Women. I don't like podium, so it's next. I'm so pleased to be kicking off this event today. Not only am I always happy to see a large group of people in our conference space, we love using this space for exactly this event. I'm particularly excited about this panel because coming from, as someone who's worked in media and communications for most of the last years, this is an issue that has touched me personally because there's so many writers and journalists that I've worked with closely over the years who have been consistently targeted for doing exactly what their jobs are, for standing up and speaking the truth, for being thoughtful, providing an analysis, and an informed analysis often. And for that reason, they have been, sometimes just harassed, sometimes just slut shamed, sometimes actually hounded off of the interwebs. And that's really frustrating when you have the kind of harassment that literally removes voices from the discourse. I mean, that's a real impact. We're no longer talking about like, oh, you should just brush it off. So this is why I was really excited when we decided to take on, when ICRW took on this research, because it's personal for so many of us who do this work. I'm also excited because I love all the people available. This is it for me. I just wanted to welcome you here and get us started. I'm going to hand this over to Preston Mitchum, who's going to ably moderate this discussion. Preston, if you don't know him, if you can imagine you don't know him, if you don't know Preston, Preston is senior global legal, it's a lot, super smart legal expert at Advocates for Youth. Before that, he was at Change, but he's also, for those of us who have been reproductive justice advocates, it's another longtime fellow passionate activist on reproductive justice and queer rights. And you probably read his work in The Atlantic. You should follow him on Twitter. So I'm very excited, and I'm so glad you could be here. And I'm handing it on over to you. Thank you, Preston.
I always appreciate it.
Oh, you too, babe.
Hi, everybody. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Okay. So I'm always really excited with or without coffee, so I really appreciate the energy that will come back. So good afternoon. My name is Preston Mitchum. I'm the Senior Legal and International Policy Analyst with Advocates for Youth. Thank you to ICRW for really hosting this, what I know will be a wonderful discussion. So welcome to Technology Facilitated Gender-Based Violence, disrupting its impact on our public and private lives. So as I said, I work for Advocates for Youth, and we're dedicated to championing policies and programs, both domestically and globally, related to young people's sexual and reproductive health and rights. That includes many things from HIV to abortion. Abortion is really how we got started, and comprehensive sexuality education is really how we got started. So we really do a lot of work on health and human rights. I also use this moment to say that I'm on the board of directors for Collective Action for Safe Spaces. And so it's those two things that really bring me here to talk about safe and supportive environments and what the intersection of technology and gender-based violence can look like for the community it impacts. So I'll start with talking about Know Your Nine. Know Your Nine is a survivor and youth-led project of Advocates for Youth. It aims to empower students to end sexual and dating violence in their school. Know Your Nine envisions a world in which all students can pursue their civil right to education free from violence and harassment. We recognize that gender-based violence is both a cause of inequity and a consequence of it. And believe that women, young people, transgender, and gender non-conforming and non-binary people will not have quality in education or an opportunity until the violence ends. Today's discussion is obviously much more about what happens in an education setting, but about the ways technology can allow for the perpetuation of gender-based violence in many aspects of our public and private lives. Technology-facilitated GBV comprises stalking, bullying, sex-based harassment, defamation, hate speech, exploitation, and a range of other harmful and social behaviors. Today, our incredible panel of experts will discuss how tech-facilitated GBV transcends digital boundaries to impact people's lives publicly and privately, including safety, personal relationships, civic participation, and careers. It is especially important for us to discuss what this means for marginalized communities like women and young people in trans and GMC communities. And to help us navigate this conversation, I always like to applaud beforehand for our panelists. So please, let's welcome our panelists. So we have Laura Hinson, social and behavioral scientist from ICRW, Soraya Chemaly, director of Women's Media Center Speech Project, and Betsy Bramon, the principal of Kronia Collaborative. Just so we're all on the same page, we are allocating about 20 to 25 minutes for Q&A. So always have your questions ready. We'll definitely take stacks near the end, and it can be for one or all of the panelists. This also applies if you're watching virtually. So hi if you're watching virtually. Hello.
Hello.
I hear you all, and I hear the applause already. So first up, to level set this conversation, to really talk about the studies from ICRW, we're going to have Laura Hinson.
Thanks, everyone. Really excited to be here to talk about our work on technology-facilitated gender-based violence. Excited to be part of this dynamic panel and in discussion with you all. I was supposed to co-present with my colleague Lila, but due to a family emergency, she's no longer able to be here, so I will soldier on without her. So ICRW started this work a few years ago with this initial idea of developing a set of measures to capture what we were at the time calling gender-based cyber violence. And so, like the researchers, we started with the literature, we conducted a literature review, and we conducted key informant interviews with several experts around the globe on the topic. And from there, we started pulling together a sense of, okay, what is this issue, and how do we think about it? And we kind of started calling it technology-facilitated gender-based violence. We came up with a conceptual framework, and we began to put the pieces together of what these quantitative measures would look like. From there, we headed to the field. We went to Uganda and India and talked to men and women who had experienced this issue there. And our main goal was to really get a sense of what this issue looks like in different places and among different types of people, but also to validate our measures that we had developed. So what we're going to share with you today, or what I'm going to share with you today, is our conceptual framework, which really reflects the essence of what is technology-facilitated gender-based violence. And also a few stories from our work in Uganda and India, just to kind of ground a little bit of this in real stories. So this is our conceptual framework. We actually never intended, we weren't funded necessarily to develop this, but as we started working, we realized that the field is very siloed. So people will talk about cyberbullying over here, and other people talk about online dating, harassment. And really, a lot of this is just part of the same thing. So as we went and as we learned, we kind of started collecting these things together. There are very few existing frameworks out there that do this, and we felt like it was a need in the field. And we sort of went about it with a research perspective, and this kind of has a research feel to it, but it is hopefully applicable to a wide variety of stakeholders. So don't worry, I'm not going to painstakingly walk you through every element of this framework, but I just want to give a sense to you about what this is. So this really reflects an experience of technology-facilitated gender-based violence. It starts with a relationship. That relationship may be personal, it may be impersonal or institutional. And then on the left side of the framework, you have kind of what's related to the perpetration aspect. So you have a motivation and an intent. And maybe that, for example, maybe the perpetrator is jealous and he or she wants to kind of cause psychological harm to someone. Or potentially they have an ideological agenda and they want to reinforce patriarchal norms for women who are, quote, behaving badly online. These are kind of just some examples of what that aspect looks like. Then we have behaviors, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with these behaviors. These are the behaviors we see in gender-based violence: stalking, defamation, bullying, etc. And these behaviors are motivated by cross-cutting tactics, which are in that box below. And these are the technological-based actions. This is really where the technology piece comes in. And through our work, we focus primarily on 6 tactics: doxing, hacking, threats, image-based abuse, impersonation, and unwanted messaging or posting. And these tactics occur, through a mode, whether that's Facebook, Twitter, or SMS. We sort of categorize them into their thematic areas. And it also happens within a certain period of time and with a certain frequency. Then on the right side of the framework is everything having to do with the victim survivor. It's the impacts that he or she experiences, whether that's aspirational, physical, psychological, social, economic, or functional. And then it also reflects the help-seeking and coping behaviors that they might have. So they've had this experience, they've had an influence. What do they do about it? Are they reporting it to the police? Are they reporting it through the technological platform mechanisms? Are they seeking counseling services? Are they changing their behaviors online? Are they withdrawing their accounts? Are they avoiding this completely? That's an important part of understanding coping mechanisms. And finally, all of this, I would say this is my favorite part of the framework, all of this is contextualized by the social, gender, cultural, legal, political, religious, and technological norms within a culture. Each of us exist and are operating by these things, and it's different across the world. So understanding that this is all happening within a certain context. So that's our framework in a nutshell. It's a little bit of a living document because as we keep learning, we keep sort of changing things, especially because technology is always evolving. So it's always providing us with new tactics that we have to sort of think about. So now I just want to highlight a few stories that emerged from our research on what people's experience with this issue are like. This first story comes from a university student in Kampala that I interviewed. And this quote really speaks so well to her experience. She was running for political office within the university. And this quote that just kept coming up is, when you're a woman in politics, you suffer twice. And you see this because during her campaign as she's running for office, she experienced these things. She had her personal information exposed on social media, which is doxing. She received a barrage of repeated and unwanted private messages from strangers. She received many misogynistic posts on Facebook and her WhatsApp groups that she was part of. Things like, you're a woman, you should not be involved in politics. You're going against the grain, and far worse. She had multiple of her accounts hacked. She had threats of physical and psychological harm, including someone telling her if she didn't withdraw that they would break her legs and put her in a wheelchair. And she had several of her photos manipulated into pornographic images. And not surprisingly, this resulted in severe impacts. She was sad and depressed. She had very strong self-imposed social isolation and withdrawal. She didn't want to leave. She didn't want to walk around campus. She lost many financial, social, and professional opportunities. She also, quote, walked in fear, not just out of physical fear, but also out of just everyone around her seeing her and knowing who she is and feeling insecure about that. And she also scaled down her political ambition. She withdrew from the political campaign and sort of resigned to taking a much lower post. A second example that comes from India is about a trans man that our colleague interviewed, and he had made a video about his transition, and he was hoping to share this video with some people to help them if they maybe were in a similar position as he was. However, the producer of that video aired it on YouTube without proper editing, without consideration of privacy settings, and without the participant's consent. So he experienced his other related photos and contact information were used and circulated without his consent. He received multitudes of unwanted messages from strangers, hateful, hurtful messages on a variety of different social media outlets from strangers and relatives. He was threatened by his employer, and his partner and immediate family were harassed because they supported him. And ultimately, this experience resulted in him feeling shame and stigma about his gender identity, sadness and depression, including suicidal thoughts, significant loss of trust and loss of relationships, social and acquaintances. Ultimately, he resigned from his job because of the environment was so harassing. And he continued to live in fear that his video would be leaked. So I'm going to leave you with 4 takeaways. And this was excruciatingly hard for me to do because there are just so many things that I want to talk about with this issue. So they are kind of broad, but hopefully kind of, again, set the stage for the other panelists and discussion for later. So first, we spoke to a lot of individuals with a wide range of experiences, from their ex-partners saying mean things about them on Facebook to online abuse that spills into the physical domain, resulting in stalking. And many participants, especially those whose identities run counter to the norm, such as women who are in male-dominated fields like cobbling and construction, or individuals with non-conforming sexual orientations, experience many, many tactics over a long period of time. These impacts of these experiences on people's lives were tremendous, especially in these contexts where there's not a lot of support, legal or social otherwise, and it impacted their careers, their ambitions, the opportunities they had. It impacted their families, and in some cases, their children. And again, I want to make this point, and I think it's one that other panelists will touch on today, which is that these were not just one-off experiences where people just, something bad happened online and they can just walk away from it. These experiences were connected and they were related to the very essence of who these people were, you know, their identities, their careers, their hobbies, their choices, their sexual orientation and gender identity. Wasn't something that happens online in this space that's over here that didn't impact their day-to-day. It did impact their day-to-day reality. And finally, you know, yes, context matter, culture matters. You know, there are specific ways and differences in terms of what is considered offensive or violent or how people are impacted by this. For example, some of the Indian participants talked about this impacting their marriageability, where this wasn't so much of a theme in Uganda. But overall, I would say the experiences between these settings were very common, which I think is important because that has implications for how we measure it and that we can measure it and globally and leverage that data hopefully and make a big impact, make policy changes, recommendations for technology companies, whatever it may be. So as a researcher, that's always exciting about how we might use data. So that's it. These are my colleagues that I've worked with along the way on the project. And thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to the next panelist. I do have a few copies of the brief that we've put out on the framework, as well as the literature review that I mentioned. So if you're interested, let me know. I don't have a ton, but I have some. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. So I think even from this first presentation, right, we can already see the level of setting of what's happening, even within 2 case study examples, one being a trans man and the experiences that he had and the impact that technology facilitated GBV had on his personal life, and also the experience in Uganda. I think the quote that I wrote, that when you are a woman in politics, you suffer twice. And I think it really, like, in this particular setting, it definitely like relates to the interrelationship intersection of both misogyny, sexism, politics, and political ideology, coupled with the ability, audacity to run for office in an educational setting, and the connections that have with particular cultural settings. And so thank you for setting the tone for us. Though somber it may be, I do think there's opportunity for right and hope down the line, but we do need to actually have these realistic conversations around what happens, because it is with lived experiences and something that's not disconnected from how they live their day-to-day lives. So thank you. Next up, we have Soraya from the Women's Media Speech Center, who's going to give another phenomenal presentation, really on the overview of particular vulnerabilities and institutional issues.
I'm not texting them. And I hope I don't totally throw you into a pit of despair. But I will try. My name is Soraya Chemaly, and I came to be doing this work as a writer. As a person who was focusing on feminism and social justice, it rapidly became apparent that there was a lot of hostility to anybody who challenged what I would describe as deeply embedded patriarchal norms. And that meant rape threats and death threats. And the thing that was really concerning to me, aside from issues of personal safety, was how many people were ceding public space, how many were choosing to change their tone, what they wrote about, where they wrote. And I think we saw that a lot in the last US election, where women in the millions went into private Facebook spaces. You know, and that wasn't considered a degradation of democratic principles. And so a few years ago, I started writing about it, and then working in collaboration and coalition with women around the world who were focused on these issues, and started a network called the Safety and Free Speech Coalition, because a lot of the approaches we were seeing from tech companies that we were challenging was all about women's safety. It was very paternalistic. And we were more interested in making sure that women could participate in civic, political, and artistic life equally, which is not happening right now. And so we too encountered this issue of what we mean by online harassment. And we came up with a framework that looked at specific categories of harm, some of which are legal. For example, in the yellow band, we put things like defamation and libel, right? These laws change across the world, nation to nation. So jurisdiction's always an issue, but we thought, what does online abuse mean? What specific language can we urge people to use so that it's not dismissed as something harmless or trivial. And so we have certain tactics like rape and death threats, doxing and swatting, stalking, impersonation. And then if there are legal categories that those fall into, how do we recognize those? And that would include intentional infliction of emotional harm, child pornography, there's a whole set of things. But we wanted to contextualize it in an easy graphic by saying, what are the actual harms to people who are targeted? So this includes emotional harm, health, safety, dignity, civil rights, reputation, professional life, freedom of expression, financial costs. And so we really wanted to do this. The Women's Media Center is really focused on representation and inclusivity in media and tech. And we wanted to do this to help media interpret what was happening in ways that implicated systemic problems and institutions. So we used this as a working tool. Now, the thing that's really striking to me about this is a few things. One is here we are in a room where I think there are 2 men that are not associated with this planet, right? And that's a huge problem because we keep talking to each other. And I kind of joke that every time I speak, I should make it contingent on the invitation being bring a man to the event. Maybe now 5 men, right? Because this is a huge obstacle for us, that we are speaking in these spaces, which I so appreciate. Like, I know many people in this room who are doing really important work all the time, but that's an issue that we need to just think about and strategize around to address this. I'll give you an example. I was at a meeting last week called the Greater Good Gathering, and it was wonderful. And it was about how to envision better outcomes for the world and consider technology and changing the social order. And the only real point I wanted to make was that there were no greater good meetings by this group of people that focused on finding ways for girls and women to walk safely in their own neighborhoods. And that until we address that greater good, none of this other greater good conversation was going to be truly meaningful. And it was striking to me that the standards for these conversations often center around assessments of risk. And the question is, who's assessing risk? Because we're not assessing risk institutionally. So there was a lot of focus on anonymity. But anonymity is not, in fact, the major problem for most girls and women, because they're being targeted and assaulted by people they know or people in their communities. Their family members, their political parties, their classmates, their neighbors, their doctors, their bus drivers, right? Pick your person, right? And so if we prioritize anonymity, we automatically deprioritize the way women experience this violence online. And I think that another important factor in this is image-based abuse. I was so happy that this came up in your research, because a lot of the current solutions in terms of corporations and tech companies and machine learning are focused on text. And that's important. But in fact, text is, clearly not obsolete, but we have moved from text to image. We have moved from words to memes. We are moving rapidly into fully immersive virtual environments in which text is not going to help us. And girls and women, children and women, marginalized people are always immediately and pervasively more likely to be targeted by the newest technologies, and that includes photo manipulation, which we see all the time in terms of women politicians and women in media. Right? If you really want to see where the technology is going to be abusive and who it's going to affect first, I urge you reluctantly to consider pornography, because virtually every new technology is deployed first in distributing pornography. So deep fakes, for example, which are virtually indistinguishable videos from real videos, started off in pornography. And I think that speaks to something else that is important to us, which is that the kind of targeting and violence and abuse that we see is part of what's now being referred to often as surveillance capitalism, because the systems themselves are surveillance systems, and they're really monetized. So for tech companies, content is neutral. If someone is being harassed, it causes engagement, and engagement is what is rewarded, right? That's what's profitable. And so, you know, I'm thinking of Leslie Jones in Twitter, who was horribly targeted. And then there was a social response in defense of her. Both forms of engagement line Twitter's pockets, right? Because there was just active, constant participation and emotional resonance. And so understanding the economics of the problem, I think, is also really important. The last thing that I want to say about this is we tend to think of these issues in terms of people, individuals, personal safety, which is super important. But in fact, every tactic and effect on any schema like this is also functioning at a macro level institutionally. And so when we hear fake news, I hear impersonation, right? If you think of the ways that technology was weaponized in our political system, you can map it onto like a Duluth model of power and control. And you can move from the micro to the macro. And I think that's important because I really think that what's happening is when we think about intersectional gender harms, we think of individuals, but in fact, because we have so much more diversity in the workplace, marginalized people are taking their vulnerabilities into the workplace, and then those spaces become quote unquote feminized in terms of the violence and the threats that can be made against them. So if you are a major news outlet and you have a woman investigative reporter and she's going, she's really investigating a corrupt government, the parameters for what you might find acceptable in the job or as a factor of risk or as an institutional response to support your own employees change, and they're not changing fast enough. So we have huge spikes in violence against journalists. And as is the case offline, women journalists have the additional layer of hypervigilance that comes with knowing that they can always be raped. And that's meaningful, right? Because that, and women politicians too, we know that this is happening to women politicians around the world. So NDI has a great program called Not the Cost, which really studies this issue. And this research is wonderful because when you bring all of this together, you can just see a deeper, richer portrait of what's happening. And I firmly believe that to really understand what's happening, you have to look at it globally. You have to understand how global cross currents are affecting women everywhere. Like you can be a woman politician in England and the threats that you're getting against you and your children are coming from a man in Michigan, right? Like we know there's a macho fascistic global backlash and that technology enables that. Technology isn't respecting borders, technology doesn't care, it actually benefits from not respecting borders. And so being able to talk to people about the relationship between the individual and the institutional problems, I think is important in framing this particular issue. I'm gonna stop there.
I'm gonna really just talk about creative capitalism from here on out.
Yeah.
It's such an interesting concept, and one that I think we all see happening.
Yeah, we see
today.
it happening.
Thank you so much. And that's
So we've got some really great information from my colleagues up here, and there's so many different ways you can talk about gender-based violence online, how to address it, what it is, what to call it, all the different terms, all the different particular threads that are happening. And sometimes it can feel overwhelmed. I imagine some of you might be feeling a little bit overwhelmed right now. It's okay. I think one thing that's important to remember that can sometimes be helpful is that because tech is a part of almost every aspect of our lives, and gender and social norms are a part of every aspect of our lives, that means that there are parts of those aspects that are very relevant to the work that each one of us is doing, and very specific to what each one of us is doing. So I think one of the important things is to really start where you are, wherever you are, what your context is, what your expertise is, who your audience is. So with that, I'm going to start with my context. I spent 7 years at the U.S. Department of State working on human rights policy and programs broadly. I did a lot of work on internet freedom, and which is very focused on human rights online, freedom of expression online for dissidents around the world, making sure that people have their civil and political rights and are able to communicate freely and all of that jazz. So I also worked a lot on gender equality policy and gender-based violence. So I have kind of a unique experience of trying to swirl these things together and within a very hierarchical, rigid institution. So I'm going to share with you all a little bit about my experience working on trying to pull these things together. Like Laura said earlier, it's really hard to do this because even within the issue, even within the area of GBV online, tech facilitated harassment, it's siloed, okay? And outside of that, it's definitely siloed, you know? People like to get in their lane, they feel comfortable in that. And when you're combining different sets of priorities, interests, issues, it makes it more complex, and sometimes people disengage. But there is a way to bring those things together. So similar to what Soraya was talking about, thinking about how all these systems combine, the social, political, economic, you know, all of those things are part of our lived experiences, and each one of us has really valuable lived experiences related to this work. So what I'm going to do is just kind of give you a case study. These are two pictures of two different pieces of policy that I worked on at the U.S. Department of State. One is the U.S. strategy to prevent and respond to gender-based violence globally. And the other one is a fact sheet about inclusive technology, bringing together a very basic policy, simple policy framework around digital inclusion, violence against women, and gender-based violence, and human rights. So before I get into the nitty-gritty, I want to share with you kind of a framework for thinking about how to work on institutionalizing, whether it's programming, whether it's policy, whether it's you know, community engagement. The first one is to think about where you are. Like I said earlier, who are you? Where are you from? Who's your audience? Who are you working with? Is it a faith group? Is it your tenant association? Is it you know, the hotel that you visit all the time? Sorry, you were telling me earlier. You know, what is it? You have an audience and you have power in a lot of different kinds of situations. So think about your context and start to map who your partners are. Who are your obvious allies that you can start brainstorming with? The next one is evidence and education. So you start with that, you're gonna like work on finding your evidence, you're gonna work on educating people about what that evidence is. Sometimes you're gonna have to find it in your very specific context, one-on-one, and sometimes there'll be wonderful researcher frameworks like Laura's, which you can pull from to work on that. Consultative and transparent. The more people you get involved with in conversation about what you're trying to do, they have a stake in it. This part is laborious. It takes a lot of time. Sometimes it's excruciatingly painful, depending on the audience. But it's a very important. If you've ever watched Parks and Rec, you have a really great example of consultations. But it is very important. It helps people feel like they have a stake in it. They feel listened to, and you learn a lot of really important things that you wouldn't know otherwise. And you start to build buy-in. You start to build your community of experts and implementers, your little army for implementing what you're trying to do. Remain targeted and contextual. This kind of goes along with starting where you're at. It's very important to be specific in your solutions as much as you can. It's really hard to, while there are definitely these global cross currents of themes about what people are experiencing, when it comes to solutions, over and over and over again, advocates I've worked with across the world will almost always say that there isn't a silver bullet. We've really got to engage the local folks and their voices on what the solutions are. Process, cogs and champions, finding that whatever that process is, that's part of mapping your power as well. Knowing who the gatekeepers are and working, slowly to find those. And some of that is also just like the really nitty gritty kind of boring stuff of process, but it gets you somewhere, usually. Adaptive and cyclical. All of these things are happening in layers, and they're happening simultaneously. They're happening at once, and they're also changing, constantly changing. The work that we were doing in 2015 and 2016 really changed a lot in 2017, 2018. Political dynamics change, centers of power change, the ways that people are willing to collaborate, the terms you can use. It depends on your context. So kind of think about this. I call it the samsara of institutionalizing because it is the cycle of birth and death and birth and death and rebirth. And really kind of staying grounded with your partners and your allies as you figure out how to continually iterate on what you're doing is so important, keeping the momentum going. So just very briefly, these are just two kind of examples of how some of this kind of plays out. So you might notice here, so the GBV strategy, okay, and this is like, actually the beginning of these two things actually started long before these two pieces of formal policy, but this one is the cyberspace strategy. This was in 2011. This one was the original GBV strategy, started in 2012. That was kind of a while ago now. Just remember that, like, you gotta have that long-term vision, right? Or you just gotta keep plodding along, right? You don't know how long it's gonna take or what it's gonna take, but you are leaving breadcrumbs for yourself and for others. If you're not gonna be there to build on this thing, somebody else will. You gotta trust that, right? So basically, this is kind of an illustration to show you the policies, programs, consultations, negotiations, the internal and external policy advocacy, the programmatic implementation, internet freedom programs. This is one of the largest U.S. government, well, it's one of the largest grant programs, public or private, on internet freedom globally, and it still is. Being able to integrate gender and historically marginalized groups into that programming has a significant reverb for years to come when you think about it. So really working on that really boring, iterative work internally that nobody can see to try to make sure that people are really thinking about analyzing and rewarding and understanding the value of inclusion and diversity within processes, not necessarily just without, is very important. But that same thing of thinking about inclusion and outreach and consultation was very important part of the GBV strategy. We did a lot of different kinds of outreach and consultations with experts around the world and of course in the United States. So the mix of programs and policies, and there were a lot of different programs that also kind of came out of this interagency strategy, which was blessed by the White House, and this as well. So all of these things kind of mishmashed together helped us to be able to have this like trail of breadcrumbs on each side to justify the eventual creation of like a basic framework. And this is a fact sheet. This is not like an authoritative big, like, here we go policy. It is a formal statement from the United States government, from the State Department, that says these issues matter, they're connected, here's how you can think about them. And for the context of the State Department, being able to say it simply and directly is one of the most important things you can do. So, and this was not just like for the outside world, but also for like State Department officials internally. So things like this help build up eventually, to get where you need to go. This is just an illustration of how the work on both of those very siloed spaces and some of that work that kind of ended in the fact sheet was integrated into a whole lot of multilateral, bilateral, public and private sector spaces, programs, and policies. So these breadcrumbs that you leave yourself along the way with policy, with publishing what you're learning, documenting whatever it is, can help create more and more momentum, reverb for changing norms, right? Thinking about the normative impression of how you're going to kind of steer a conversation about these issues that are very complex and hard for people to understand. And these are just a few really quick things to kind of caution you to be aware of. These are common kind of traps that people fall into when they're thinking about gender-based violence online. So unexamined power if you are a tech company, if you have a lot of, so everybody has different kinds of power. You have status, you have resources, you have convening power, you have a lot of different types of power. If your power is unexamined and you are asking someone with a different kind of power set than you for something, you need to understand what that is. If you are a donor and you're asking people to give you input on things, don't leave it dead in the water. Like, figure out what the process is for looping back to them, and maybe even eventually pay them for their very hard work. If you are a tech company, same thing. It's really important to publicize these great partnerships that you're doing with civil society organizations and experts on issues like domestic violence or gender-based violence online. Have convenings, but if it just goes dead in the water, if it's not connected to some sort of institutional path, then that becomes kind of a really difficult kind of transaction where you're really exploiting that power that you have to get people to do a lot of free work for you. We need to value a lot of different kinds of opinions. It's similar with tokenism and homogeny, making sure that there's not just like that we really do have like a more systemic way of thinking about the expertise that folks from many different backgrounds and experiences and identities can bring, and making sure that that's a part of the process. Victim blaming, this is kind of related to what Soraya was talking about earlier with media companies who are expecting all of their investigative reporters to do this very risky work, but when it comes to women reporters, they're not taking any institutional responsibility for it. So it becomes like a passive and institutionalized victim blaming situation when that institution is not recognizing the inherent risks that people have to take in order to do their jobs well. Protectionism, another great example, the kind of paternalistic ways that people talk about ends up being excuses for surveillance, censorship, and shutdowns, basically, which we don't want. And internet exceptionalism, this is one I'll just touch on really briefly. Sometimes you do need new laws and new frameworks to talk about gender-based violence or a human rights issue or whatever, but most of the time we have really complex and effective frameworks already there. And so it's really important to try to integrate and interpret what's already existing in those structures to include the experience, the wide-ranging experience that people have with online harassment and violence. So, it's not to say that there shouldn't be a new law on doxing. There are a lot of different ways to approach it, and it comes with like a whole panoply of context. But for instance, our Violence Against Women Act in the United States, every 3 years when it comes up for reauthorization, there's a fair amount of really amazing work that's been integrated over time to make that set of laws LGBTI inclusive, to make sure people are working on the kinds of really complex issues that someone who is a domestic violence survivor is facing, that sort of thing. So a lot there. Silver bullets really quickly. Not one thing will fix it. AI is not going to fix it. Cryptocurrency is not going to fix it. Like whatever. It has to come back down to context, specificity, and experts. And I'm just going to leave you with this. It kind of speaks for itself. It's just to remind us about the big picture. The big picture is really helping us to remember that GBV and the way it manifests in online and digital spaces is part of a bigger set of problems. If we want to work on some of those underlying issues, these are some ways that you can think about framing that work. And if you don't work on gender-based violence, you don't work on women's rights, but you work on other things that could intersect with this, think about how you can start to make that a part of what you're doing, whatever it is, in the different spaces that you're able to bring that in. That's all.
Thank you so much. Y'all feeling good?
Yeah.
Or okay-ish, I guess, based on the information. So far, obviously, as we take a moment to reflect and kind of start to ruminate for question and answers, some of the things that I noticed around this, obviously, was really the case studies, thinking about what the case specifically found in Uganda and the context there. Also thinking about this, I said, I'm gonna keep saying the surveillance capitalism. And the on the ground work that we see happening, the experiences that we see people having online, both in frankly in public and private spaces. And then ways to build policy solutions and build allyship, or as I like to call it, co-conspirators or accomplices, to really make sure that we're actually getting the work done in effective ways, and making sure that men and non-binary, non-conforming folks are also invited into the conversation, so folks aren't talking to each other. You know, basically making sure that people who need to be here are here and are hearing loud and clear based on what's happening and how we can provide policy solutions and community solutions. And so I did want to say something, Betsy, because one of the things that I do want to definitely acknowledge with the State Department and with the USAID previously was that the GBV strategy had such a comprehensive definition of gender, and the way it looked at gender, who was included in that, what marginalized communities could look like. And I want to start with that. So what are the ways, based on your all's experiences, how are these issues impacted communities such as young people and LGBTQ individuals? An intersection of tech and gender-based violence, understanding that some of it was captured earlier, but just to have a little bit more of a conversation of communities who may be forgotten or otherwise invisibilized.
Sure, and you want to hear about that in the context of the gender-based violence definition?
In your experience, based on your work generally, it can also include that too.
Sure, yeah. I would say that going back to some of the samsara of institutionalization, being able to do having a consultative process and really relying on evidence-based and data is so important. The only reason we were able to include LGBTI folks in the definition, be able to include examples of that type of violence, like for instance, corrective rape, that often like femme people will experience in South Africa, was because there was evidence for it. And also because we fought really hard internally with a lot of different allies, and some of them are in the room, to make sure that those things didn't get erased when it came down to like negotiating, right? Because we knew that that definition was probably one of the most powerful things that the strategy could functionally be used for, you know, in terms of validating and helping advocates around the world with their own governments, with their own programs, with the ways that they're framing things, be able to turn around and have a credible, you know, source for that sort of work. So I think that really making sure that when you do those consultative practices, you are really doing intentional outreach, thinking about who's not there, thinking about how to get them there, or how to meet them. Maybe they won't show up in a public forum, but maybe they will have a coffee with you. You know, so really takes a lot of intention and trust building, because you also are not trying to be extractive. Oh, you're Black and queer, tell me what you think. Don't you want to be the symbol of all things Black and queer? We don't want that, you know, so that, you know, that's an example.
Great, thank you. And
Yeah.
Soraya or Laura, how did you work?
So, I think when you were speaking, I thought, you know, I think we should consider what non-conforming means in this context, because if you think of schoolyard bullying, kids are bullied for not conforming, and they're bullied for not conforming first and foremost to gender stereotypes, right? So a little boy who's feminine is bullied. A little girl who might step out of her lane is bullied. We don't talk about it that way. We don't talk about homophobia or sexism when kids are in first grade, right? And so if you think about that mechanism, the use of language, the way we frame those problems, and then you port it over into street harassment. Women are harassed on the street all over the world in high percentages, but gender nonconforming and sexual nonconforming people, higher levels. You add race and ethnicity to that, higher levels. And so to me, when women are harassed, it's because they're not conforming. And they're not conforming to the expectation on the street that they should have public lives, that they should be working, that they should be running for office, that they should dress the way they want, right? And when you port that online, because I think of the harassment we encounter online as a corollary to street harassment, there's digital harassment, right? You port that online and you find, for example, in journalism, that if you're a woman who writes about sports or tech, much more likely to be harassed. If, God forbid, you write about sexual violence or homophobia, much higher chance that you're going to be harassed. And so I think using the bigger framework of not conforming to patriarchal norms and expectations and rigid rules is helpful to understanding those dynamics, whether you're online or off.
Absolutely. And I will say, I mean, to provide some real life context, so collective action for safe spaces, for those who don't know, in DC, there's a group, and the purpose of our group is really to really fight against sexual and gender-based violence within the nation's capital. Last year, we got the Street Harassment Prevention Act passed in DC. It was physical fighting. Some non-physical fighting. But the real thing is now we're worried about the implementation of it, right? And so a lot of it's like, what are you providing money and programs to? Who are the people that you're calling bystanders? How are they being called? And a lot of the research that we did beforehand was really what happened from folks online and what happened in real life. And the spaces that it happened in, particularly maybe around like Chinatown, or when we saw more high volume and who was actually in those spaces, and how race and ethnicity and gender got involved, and folks who were not conforming and what does not conforming look like within patriarchal systems.
So the work that you were doing, it was really striking to me as a writer too, and an activist, because when I interview a lot of women and I say, well, have you experienced street harassment? They might say, no, I haven't. But then you say, do you look people in the eye when you're walking? And they say no. And then you say, do you exercise outside? They say no. So in fact, they're avoiding the possibility of harassment, which is a function of harassment, right? But the other thing they often say, honestly, is that even if it's just in the unconscious language, is that they seem to think that Black and brown men harass them more, right? And the thing that's striking to me about that is that if you scale up, more elite white men are pervasively harassing institutionally. They're doing it in media. They're paparazzi. They're framing the news. They're deciding which stories are important and which ones aren't. They are actually harassing their coworkers. So last week there was a Facebook group outed. French male journalists had set this up to come together to coordinate targeted harassment against women journalists. And they thought that was fine. Like, who thinks that's fine, you know? And so that is a really deep institutional form of harassment that isn't recognized as the same thing. And it's gender harassment because it's about not conforming.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Laura, I know you touched on the example in your case study, the example of the transcends in India. Do you have anything else in your research or anything you would like to explore around how LGBTQ and young people are, besides everything, the ways in which LGBT and young people are impacted?
Sure, and yeah, just to kind of tie everything together, I mean, I hope I made it clear that we take an intersectional approach, and gender norms is really critical to all of our work. So not surprisingly, these issues came up. I mean, we didn't have all the money in the world to talk to all the people in the world, so we had to really kind of think about who we were trying to target, and we did purposely want to target LGBTI to talk to them. In Uganda, it was nearly impossible given the situation there. We tried many different strategies and tactics, including, anyway, I won't get into that, but we were unsuccessful. It was much easier in India. We actually targeted young people a little bit less because we felt like we wanted to hear more from older people that are using technology, just because I think young people, technology, they're in it, we hear a bit more from them. That was also a little challenging to find. It was just easy to find university students always. But yeah, I mean, there's so many different ways to kind of think about who's experiencing this and what are some of their own vulnerabilities. So yeah, we just started the process, but we're ready to do more.
Yeah. And I'm keeping my eye on the time because I really want to hear from you all. So I guess before that, one of the questions that I would like to ask is, what can tech companies do to at least attempt to ameliorate some of the issues? I hope you are watching virtually or in the room. But what is it that some tech companies can do to ameliorate the harassment, the stalking, the cyberbullying, the doxing?
I start. So I think a few things. First, diversify their own leadership and then they're desegregate their work. So if you look at a typical tech company, 80 to 95% of engineers are men. Not even that multi-ethnic, to be honest. And then if you look at what I call the cleanup work, the security, privacy, customer communications, that's women. They're doing that work. So what you have is a workforce organized around optimizing risk, profiting from risk taking, and as Facebook says, moving fast and breaking. And then you have the other part of the workforce doing the management of people and their feelings and their getting hurt. And that's really problematic, right? It's a mirror of the sex segregation of the labor force that we have in general, but it's really impactful in our tech. And I think too, not trying to fix policies so much as shape the products so that the products themselves are not so easily weaponized. They're so easily weaponized because the assessment of risk at the starting point is poor. And those are the things that I think are really important. I mean, a lot of us in this room have worked together for several years with tech companies to address these issues. And there are a lot of really smart, well-meaning people in tech companies trying to do the same things, but they too are marginalized within their own companies. And so, you know, you see, I kind of chuckle when I hear that the tech world in Silicon Valley is like a progressive place that's really focused on free speech. Because I don't really see a whole lot of concern for liberating the speech of people who traditionally haven't had it.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I think what's challenging is that you have, with tech companies, you have spaces that are inherently built for one thing. And kind of like Soraya said, the products, because they have been so grossly under-examined for risk, and maybe if they've been examined for risk, it might be for one very or a very limited kind of homogenous group and set of experiences and a set of more kind of elite or privileged experiences, that the fallout is really great for everybody else. So it's challenging because it's not built for that. And so there is all this cleanup work that you're saying. There are a lot of things companies are trying to do to clean up their act.
Right.
Vilifying companies is not going to get us anywhere, but also holding them to account for taking more institutional responsibility for the problem and not leaving it to their policy teams and communication teams and their women and safety teams
Or
to
unpaid networks of advocates.
exactly the unpaid labor of expertise which they rely on, which they also gain a lot of status and credibility from having. So there's a lot of really tricky dynamics there. It kind of reminds me a little bit in some ways of working in a place like the State Department, which is not inherently supposed to be working on human rights. That's not why people are there. But it can work on it, and it has worked on it, done great things on that. But when you're working on those issues, you're kind of along the edges. And in order to get anything done, you gotta like infiltrate and speak the language, and speak the bottom line of whoever it is that you're working to, advocating to internally. And until there is stronger leadership and actual commitment from a top-down level, there's not gonna be a lot of institutional change because there already are the armies of people who give a damn working super hard at all of these tech companies, but it's like being on a treadmill.
Right.
Nothing more to add to that, but just thinking about it from a research angle. I mean, I think a lot of tech companies have their own internal data capture systems that they use to try to understand this issue and work on it, and that seems to be kind of the reaction that, no, we're collecting data, we understand this issue, but are they asking the right questions? And I think thinking about data and how we can leverage data to push back a little bit.
And are they sharing it with researchers?
Yeah, exactly.
That's a huge issue of transparency, and it has consistently been the case.
Exactly. So that would be sort of my dream, to get some really good data and
Data will matter again, I promise. All right, yes, that's the hand over there. So we're gonna We're gonna take a stack of questions for those who may have, so we're gonna start over here, and are there any others on stack?
There's some offline right here too.
Yeah, do you have one too? All right, and then 3, and then the next round, we'll check with you, Joe, and see if there are any online. All right, thank you.
I don't know the answer to this question, but I was on the regulation side from the government, the PI-led FCC. Has there been any work that we should familiarize ourselves in terms of technology?
Oh,
Specifically PI-led.
So
Okay,
there's,
so that's,
yeah.
sorry, we're
No,
gonna
you
take
should go ahead.
two more and then.
I think returning to this question of freedom of speech, we know that the Communications Decency Act is often used as a way to
Yes.
legislate a lot of these things, but then it is also used to then defend against things like hate speech. So I'm thinking about sort of in the broader digital ecology
Right.
where this is happening, we also know that there are men's rights activists and incels who are also using places like Reddit to mobilize. And so I'm wondering sort of within that, how do we conceive of freedom of speech while also sort of accounting for the harms that are occurring because of this?
Right.
You got it.
She also led our literature review.
Right.
You mentioned that the tech companies are working on it, they're improving, whereas every day I follow the New York Times and my personal experience, just like 4 weeks ago, my camera opened on me all of a sudden, like I was exchanging an email with an activist and journalist overseas, and I logged out of my camera just went on. I don't even have activated it. I'm very careful. So I just want to know, there are lots of violations, third parties, fourth parties, God knows who are these third parties that get into your apps, so I'm living in fear. I don't have anything. I keep on exchanging my routers, and still I get hacked and harassed. So I don't think they're doing anything. Sorry. The last thing was a FaceTime,
Right.
thing, but.
So thank you. So we have questions around regulations, specifically FCC. We have one on, I think, the age-old question around freedom of speech and what that really can look like, both in terms of our ability to speak freely, but other folks who completely disagree with us and sometimes use violence to also speak freely. And then the third one around what are tech companies really doing, I guess is the best one, if anything.
They need to do.
They need to do much more, right? Yeah. So questions around like tech companies and what is it from your experience that you've actually seen them starting to really do? Again, back to the amelioration of our own fear based on what we see happening in our own personal lives.
Absolutely. Really quickly, with the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, issues like net neutrality are really important, and they affect such a wide range of issues of education, poverty, access, everything about our rights. I mean, basically, if you don't know about net neutrality, educate yourself and find out about it. This is about not being siloed, kind of going back to the point of us trying to really be multi-sectoral in the ways that we work as advocates. So, pay attention to what's going on with that, sign on to some letters, get your organization to pay attention to it and get them to sign on, figure out which coalitions to join and do it. You don't have to do all the work, let somebody else who's an expert do the work, but your voice should be heard in that because you will be affected and are affected by that. So that's one thing. When it comes to freedom of expression and Communications Decency Act, I mean, with freedom of expression, I mean, the thing I always like to ask people is you need to examine the paradigm from which the freedom of expression comes up from, right? Whose freedom of expression are we talking about? Why is it a problem now? So I think it is an age-old question. It's very complex, but we have a multi-dimensional set of voices that are truly being sidelined, and it's probably the majority and not the minority that's being protected. So there's a balance there within our institutional frameworks of the way we think about and all our precedents on freedom of expression, which are favoring and privileging a smaller group. So that's hard. Like, there's not a good answer to that, but it's important to at least recognize that that's part of the problem.
It's also, it varies so greatly across the globe. And so the United States has an outlier freedom of expression ethos. It does not prioritize dignity. It just doesn't. Hate speech is not illegal in this country. And so defining and regulating hate speech is incredibly complex. There are, however, some pretty clear-cut issues for platforms who often claim that they are maximizing freedom of speech in the interest of greater freedoms. But one of my favorite examples from the Arab Spring, which was the revolution, social media revolution, was it was all about freeing people's expression until Arab women started protesting topless. And nobody was that interested in seeing an Arab woman with the words "fuck your morals" on her chest. So the freedom of expression stopped at the door. And she wasn't being salacious. She made a political statement, and it was not categorized, because it was a woman and God breasts, as political, right? And so all of those kind of cultural norms come into play at very, very local levels. And one of the defaults for tech companies is we need to respect local cultures. But once you start respecting local cultures, you start messing with women's rights at the most basic level. And there's a real tension in that everywhere. And Section 230 of the Federal Communications Act is a tiny little clause, like 148 words, that basically says we're not going to hold these companies liable for things that are published. And we continue with this pretense that they are tech companies and not media companies. And here we are in this mess because of that. I think it's really complicated.
I mean, that's basically what I was gonna say. This is an extremely complicated issue. It's gonna require a lot of different voices to fix, and you're dealing with gender norms, which are really hard to change. We've been working on this a long time. You put all that in the same pot, and you're gonna have to let it simmer for a long time before things come out, so.
Yeah, and I also think about, in terms of the freedom of speech, also as a lawyer and as an activist, these things are sometimes counter to one another. I often think about why freedom of speech became laws in the first place, whose freedoms are we oftentimes protecting, what power looks like when someone is finally stripped you of said power. And also think about pairing that with the current cultural and political climate, right? So like who's actually being in place in things like the Supreme Court and federal district courts, who's upholding the rights of particular people. It's usually folks who already have access to power and resources. And so, though I think it's complicated, and why I give much love and respect to places like the ACLU, and the difficulty sometimes it has with defending both Black Panther Party and KKK, I just think about just really how freedom of speech has been used to really harm marginalized communities, most of who we are talking about today, and really how it's helped to empower folks who already have access to power to build it in this local way. We're going to go online. Joe, do we have any current questions?
Yes. I'll try to pull some together in a little more concise form. So, Laura, you touched on the tech companies having data. Soraya talked a little bit about the transparency or lack of that. I think one of the questions has to do with, are there tools or techniques we're aware of that we could use in gathering data on the issue of gender-based violence online? The second piece to that is, what additional research questions should the community raise to both monitor and evaluate progress on this issue? So it's kind of merging two questions into the research piece. And then maybe I'll do one more. Is what role can technology play in the documentation and disclosure of the identities of perpetrators, but also its role in the public discourse on the larger cultural context of GBV?
So very light questions. So thank you. In 3 minutes or less. No, but however much time you may need to answer questions, both in terms of data and really a disclosure of these perpetrators.
Well, really quickly on the perpetrator question. So naming and shaming has been around since the beginning of time. There are a lot of different ways that different organizations and community activists have tried to use that. Me Too is a great example of naming and shaming. There's a limitation to where that can take you. It can kind of take you so far. So you have to use that tool if you're going to use it in an ecosystem of other tools to try to get more at the institutional issue. Part of the problems that we have with things like sexism or misogyny in our country is that people want to think that, they were a good person. This was an exceptional situation. This was interpreted weirdly, they're a father and they have daughters, things like that. Well, it's not, you can be good and bad at the same time. You can be relatively good and make stupid decisions. We've all probably experienced that ourselves, and that's part of the problem with like a false framing around, and part of why naming shaming perpetrators can only take you so far. And it might get at some institutional issues, but it becomes like a liability game for companies. So they get rid of this person who's the symbol of that thing, and then they think they're all better. That's when you have to kind of find those internal champions, leadership, and the levers of power. What are their investors care? Do they? There's a lot of different ways. There are a lot of different audiences different folks will respond to when they feel pressure because they need something from them. So finding out what those levers are is part of that game.
So two things. One is I personally think that so many of us in our organizations are under-resourced, and that a lot of energy and frankly, to work well, strategy has to go into any public confrontation like that. I don't particularly advocate for naming and shaming individuals for many, many reasons, but I think that naming and shaming corporations and corporate entities can be very powerful. I met a lot of people in this room because in 2013, I organized along with Jacqueline Friedman and Laura Bates a campaign to hold Facebook accountable for recognizing misogyny online as hate, as a form of violence that we are navigating. And the way we did it was to basically share examples of rape pages. There were lots of rape pages at that point, and pages that glorified domestic violence or other forms of intersectional misogyny, to feature those alongside the advertisers who sponsored it. And we bypassed Facebook. We just went straight to the advertisers who started pulling their money. They pulled millions, and that got attention really quickly. And so we see that model all the time now, and Sleeping Giants has been really effective with like Breitbart. And so because of the time and effort it takes, I would urge you to really think about what the levers and incentives are. And if you're going to do it, to plan carefully, to build your networks, to have a really thorough idea of what you want to accomplish, what your objectives are, what success would look like. And then the second part of this is that there have been in the last 4 years, many, many more research initiatives that have been very important and are always cumulative. So this is a really good example of that. National Democratic Institute, the UN, the International Women's Media Foundation. At the Women's Media Center, we do a lot of different kinds of research, and we also aggregate all of these. Like we just created a library where we add all the time, whatever the research is, we add it to our website so that it's a collected pool.
Yeah, and just the last couple of minutes trying to tackle huge questions. I mean, just thinking about data and research questions. Like you said, just continuing to add to what we know and capturing people's stories. I think stories can tell a lot. I think they're powerful. I also think getting prevalence data of this issue, those are the big numbers. Those are what helps maybe not tech companies, but governments or other people take this seriously. It shows that a lot more people are experiencing it than they think are, and this has very long-lasting and severe impacts for people. So I think just connecting some of those dots with data would be really powerful. And there just isn't that much out there. There's a lot of good stories here and there, but like a really robust study or something, of course I'm going to advocate for that.
Right. But I'll give you an example. We did a PSA last year on women in politics. We interviewed women in the US who had run for office, were in office, or had stopped running because of harassment. And they shared their stories in these narratives. And we were able to use research that showed that 46% of women who run for office get rape and death threats. 46%, I think it is. That's a huge number, right? And there were many, many other statistics that were related to women in politics. And So there are organizations that are constantly trying to get this data. And we need that next generation of research to show what the long tail effects are. Like if you witness a woman running for office being treated in this way, you are less likely to run for office as a girl or woman. That's just like rational. It's a rational choice, you know, and that's what we need to be focusing on next.
So I'll make time for one more question, because there's a couple of minutes left, and then we'll do some wrap-up final thoughts. And so I saw your hand first.
Sorry.
But we'll be here for a little bit.
It's actually I guess a comment and an invitation to look at what's happening in France right now.
Yeah.
The French government is actually taking this really a step further, and I'm supporting the French Minister for Gender Equality on this particular topic. And one of our past ministers for the ecology, or I can't remember what her title was, just came out as a survivor from an attack from another minister. And she had got huge backlash online, and there's actually a trial coming up. So there are really concrete examples of how policies in France are starting to kind of show practices, whether they're going to be best practices or not. And if that's going to have an impact, I think it's worth following that.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you all so much. We give our round of applause. And I think it's important. Can you take 30 seconds, just any final thoughts, wrap-up thoughts, feelings? Like I'm always about them personally, but I work with a lot of young people, and it's necessary. But yeah, so 30 seconds just on any final thoughts that you would like to leave folks with, any next steps or recommendations.
Sure, yeah, I think, first of all, it's very humbling to be here because there are so many folks in this audience who have worked very hard on these issues and could easily be up here with us sharing their programs, policies, experiences. So I think we all have really valuable work and experiences, and the more we can try to figure out how to, cross those lines a little bit more, the better. Yeah, I think that really trying to figure out how to be a part of different broader coalitions, stepping outside of your international development, women's rights, gender-based violence frame, whatever one that you're in, I'm sure there are others here too, but that's probably our primary audience right now, is really, really important. So brainstorming about that, bringing that up in the next coalition meeting you're at, that sort of thing, making that a corporate question, not something that you have to carry just on your own, but something that you keep asking, often helps embed that inquiry into, the work that you're doing with others as well.
Yeah, and I think that I would ditto exactly what Betsy said, because these silos are hard for us all. And even though I'm really focused on the institutional issues, I actually think that it starts at the most personal level. Conversations, when you're socializing, you don't have to hold people accountable in humorless ways. You can hold them accountable in completely funny ways. But I think holding them accountable is really important, right? Because we have the ability to challenge opinions, which is what happens in all these viral hashtags. Each one of these viral hashtags is a change in public knowledge. It's a confrontation of dominant narratives that we've never been able to confront before because of gatekeepers in media, for example. And we have the ability to do that in our personal and private and political lives.
Short and sweet, just thanks to everyone for being here, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity to learn from everybody in this room, and also thanks to Joe, Preston, and
Yes,
thank you.
You all have been anywhere. Decided to be here.
Yes.
And I think it's because we all really care about what we see as in a relationship between tech and GPV, and the harm that's occurring in marginalized communities. And so I'll leave with this. Recognizing that obviously it starts with the personal relationships and that the interpersonal conversations that we have with folks will matter, but also recognizing that people build up these institutions, and without those interpersonal relationships and conversations, it's going to be less possible to dismantle those violent institutions. And so I hope I can at least leave us with encouragement to continue working on these issues, no matter how somber or disappointing they may be. I really do see a vision for hope and justice in this country and around the world. So thank you for all coming.